I think all of our roles are shifting. And I think our generation especially is feeling confused because the generation before us, it was so defined that we're finding our way. And that I think will take time. It'll take presence. It'll take self-reflection of like, what is it that works for our unit is also important, because it still might be the traditional way, if you want to call it the traditional way, might still work for some couples, and that's okay. But however, I think even in that, the emotional bandwidth that gets stretched when we're playing these roles still has to be at the forefront of our understanding that something needs to shift within this relationship for us to all not feel overwhelmed and overworked and suppressed when it comes to our emotional body.
In this next episode, I bring back Dr. Sonya Jensen. She is a naturopath and hormonal expert, and I'm so excited to have this conversation around male hormones for our big guys and for our little guys. In this conversation, we delve into what kinds of things are going on in our preteen and teen boys and how we can best support them from a supplement standpoint, from a just being there standpoint when they're pushing us away, and all the things that come up in your daily life with your preteens and teens if you're experiencing that season in their lives. We also touch on some of the challenges for our big men, you know, in these changing times of gender roles in our marriages. This is a really enjoyable conversation, and I look forward to you hearing it. Enjoy. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Sonya Jensen, my dear, dear friend. Dr. Sonya is an incredibly talented naturopath. I love having conversations with you with all things hormones, and I find you're one of the most intuitive and knowledgeable people. You're one of the people that I go to with any questions in my life. I mean, we pretty much touch base almost daily, if not, you know, a few times a week. And I'm so excited to sit and have this conversation with you about our men and our little men and their hormones and how we can support them. So thank you for being here again.
Oh, thank you for having me. And same for me. I love our connection and your capacity to just be so present with me. And I think it's one of the big things that we all need to work on in our connection and relationships. So thank you for mirroring that and creating this opportunity to have this discussion, because it's so important and not talked about enough.
Yes, I think this is such an important conversation because I feel like we're finally at a point where, you know, women's hormones is becoming so much more okay to discuss and to talk about, and are, you know, having a deeper understanding of our hormones and how we feel. And I know we did the podcast on leaning into the rhythms of our cycle. And for our guys, I feel like, you know, they're navigating so much, and I don't yet feel that it's a common part of the conversation, and it really, really needs to be.
For sure. And we often talk about this in our practice when we're working with couples too, that it's so common for us to hear the word menopause. And now it's becoming more common to hear the word perimenopause and PMS and all these challenges that women face as they're moving through their hormonal story. But we never hear anything about andropause. We don't hear about these challenges that men are facing, because I think for so long they were taught not to speak about the challenge, but to just pick up their socks and keep going. So this imprint that they've had for so many generations, it's very foreign to actually talk about the discomforts. And the beauty of these conversations now is that we have two young men that we're raising, and we get to have these conversations early with them to give them permission to lean into what they're feeling, their emotions, their doubts, their challenges, all of that, so that they can move through life in a very different way, so they're not feeling so blocked all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I thank God that we're in that place with our kiddos, you know, whether we call it being connected to them and their emotions, whether we call it conscious parenting, it's like meeting them where they are. And I know we're going to take a dive into that, like how we can support our preteens and our teenage boys and navigating what they're going through and not taking it personally, and how we check ourselves. And I want to start with our big guys. And, you know, we travel together a lot. I know your husband well, you know my husband well. And I feel like we're very fortunate to be in these relationships where our men are wanting to do better and are wanting to have these connected relationships with their boys and in our case, the daughter too. But it's so interesting, like you touched on, they've come from these generations of authoritarian,
Authoritarian. Mm-hmm.
yeah, parenting,
Mm-hmm.
where kids were to be seen and not heard. And especially as a boy, as a male, like you didn't talk about your feelings, you kind of stuffed it. If they weren't raised by their father was raised by their father, and probably a home where punishments were often physical
Mm-hmm.
instead of having conversations. And it's really interesting because I wonder your take on this. I look at a lot of like our dads and their dads, and I think a lot of them have also been taught so much to like stuff and numb their emotions that we see a lot of, whether it's like alcohol use
Mm-hmm.
or, now that like CBD and marijuana is getting more common. Like, I'm just seeing a lot of that in like ages 60 and up. What's your take on that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say even just an observation of those around me and growing up and witnessing that when there's no ability or there isn't this access point to your emotions and being able to really express them because they have a certain role that they're trying to fulfill. So I think a generation ago, the roles were very defined. And in that household, the male counterpart was the one going out to work, bringing in the money, taking care of the household in that way. So come, evening time after they have their dinner, their only way to actually like settle back into their bodies was to get that drink into their hands and not recognizing that then that becomes a habit, which then fuels anger, which fuels resentment, which fuels some of these lower vibration emotions because there hasn't been a way for them to express it. And I think because that has been passed forward to our generation, that our generation is one, feeling confused because I think they are trying to be more conscious. They are trying to connect to their emotions. And especially once they become a father, I think there's a big shift there because they want to do different. I don't even know if I want to use the word better because I think every generation did what they could with
Yeah.
the information that they had. My father often would say, I was so scared of my dad that he didn't even talk to me. And I wanted that to be different with you guys, but we still have our story with our father because he's still working on his own stuff too. So I
Yeah.
think we're always learning from the generation before, but there's so many of these like intricate habits, lifestyle habits, these imprints, these roles, these masks that have been passed forward that we're now finding ways to unravel it. But it's easier to distract ourselves from it. It's easier to not even look at that because there's pain underneath it and there's some deep healing underneath it. And what will happen if I open that can? Is there room for me to open that can right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so beautiful. And we talk about, again, the conversation is getting more prevalent where we're talking about women and our confusion in our roles, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
feel like we're doing different than our moms did in a lot of cases. And we have these opportunities to step outside the home and have a career and have this other purpose outside of our family and all the beauty that comes with that. And then the challenges that come with that, right? So we're like overdoing because we're doing this stuff at home, we're doing this stuff at work. Well, for our guys, it's similar. Like they're not just leaving in the morning and having this 9 to 5 job and coming and kicking their feet up in the lazy boys and having their beer the way that their fathers probably did. They're
Yeah.
coming home in a lot of these cases. They're a big part of the home unit, whether that
Mm-hmm.
means, sitting and having conversations at the table with the children or helping cook the meal or helping do the dishes. Like it's very different for them as well.
Mm-hmm. And that can be so hard in the moment when we're in our own story. Like I'll use myself as an example yesterday. So yesterday I work from home. And so, you get the kids ready, drop them off at school. I come home, I get ready. I'm on screen from like 10 a.m. till 3. Kids come home and now it's snack time. Now I'm quickly making dinner before soccer, take them to soccer, come home, feed them. And then my husband comes home around 7 o'clock, has his meal but then puts the kids to bed. He reads stories to them before bed. So that's what he does. But in my mind, because I was so tired yesterday and part of my cycle where like everything is a bit heightened, I felt resentful. I was like, I had to have one foot in work and one foot as a mom
Hmm.
all day long. And you got to just be at work and then be at home. But then I had to pause and reflect that, wait, no, that's not what he did. He was checking in most of the day. He came home. We had dinner together. He helped with the kids. He put them to bed. So yes, like you said, I think all of our roles are shifting. And I think our generation especially is feeling confused because the generation before us, it was so defined that we're finding our way. And that I think will take time. It'll take presence. It'll take self-reflection of like, what is it that works for our unit is also important, because it still might be the traditional way, if you want to call it the traditional way, might still work for some couples, and that's okay. But however, I think even in that, the emotional bandwidth that gets stretched when we're playing these roles still has to be at the forefront of our understanding that something needs to shift within this relationship for us to all not feel overwhelmed and overworked and suppressed when it comes to our emotional body.
I love you and Nick, your husband, do these really funny, like cheeky videos on the reality of like what life is like, right?
Yeah.
And there's one that you did, and it's Nick's so cute. He's like coming home from work and he's just ready to be greeted by his wife who adores him. And you think about like, that's the way that it used to be. Like these men would come home, their kids are clean, dinner's on the table, and wife is just so excited to see her guy. And when Nick walked in the door, you like handed him a big pile of laundry and threw all your stuff at him like you were just done. And so, you know, I'm curious how you guys, because I know you're constantly like working on your relationship and dealing with this reality that a lot of us have in our marriages. So how do you check yourself to bring something to each other in those moments where like we know we need it and we deserve it? We can't bring each other the worst that we have.
Yeah, I mean, it's constant practice and constant reflection, because it may not be perfect in the moment, because that scenario has happened for us before, especially when the kids were really young. You know, I'd be calling him, he'd be off at 7 and I would call at 7:01. Where are you? Why aren't you home yet?
I need you.
I need you right now. Need to pass the baby on to you so I can go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
So I definitely think that happened more when we were in that season of parenting, and it's definitely changed today. But what we do is we constantly have conversations around it. And because we're individually doing our work, we then, when we come together and we're being triggered, even if it doesn't happen in that moment, eventually we are going to have a conversation around, okay, what's actually going to work for this family? We have to sit down and reflect and then pivot if something needs to change. And for me, having come from a family where communication wasn't amazing. So I've really had to learn how to communicate my feelings in a productive way where I'm not putting everything onto him, but using words like I feel in this moment. And it's still a work in progress for me, whereas he comes from a family that's able to communicate differently. And so he's been really great for me in a sense that he's provided that mirror and kind of that guide for me where he can show me that, you know, it's okay. And if we just communicate, we can resolve all of this. So if I just communicate that I'm overwhelmed right now, it's nothing to do with you, that in this moment, I need some time. Just simply saying that, his response is always, yes, I got you. Yeah. And vice versa, for me to be able to do that for him to say, you know what, you're dumping all your shit on me right now. And it doesn't feel really good. My first response would be like, oh, what are you talking about? But then as I pause and reflect, I'm like, yeah, of course, this has nothing to do with you. It's everything to do with my overwhelm in this moment, but I just need help. It happened this morning. Thursdays, he leaves early to go train in the morning, and my oldest rolled his ankle yesterday. And so I'm here like trying to tape his ankle, make breakfast, make their lunches, do all that, get them out the door. So I phoned him. I said, I feel really alone in all of this because I'm having to decide, does he go to school? Do I go get his crutches? And he's like, okay, well, we're working on it now. So I think just having moments of being able to pause and reflect and breathe and know that you do have each other's backs. And sometimes that means allowing the other person to be vulnerable, because I think that's also a challenge. It was for me anyways, because I never saw my dad sick once. I never saw him in a vulnerable space once, except when somebody would pass, like when his brother passed away, or if he would talk about his mother, I would see some vulnerability. But I grew up with a father that was just very strong, always there, providing for his family, all of these things. So the first time I saw Nick get sick, he had his hoodie over his head. He was lying on the couch. I had this moment of like, what are you doing?
Men don't do that.
Men don't do this. I had this expectation that like, why would you take time off work and heal the way you are? And so I think we too have these expectations because of the roles that we saw our fathers play.
Yeah, 100%. I could pull a couple things there. I think that it sounds like, and I would relate to this, like communication and clarity are so important, and noticing, right? So when you talk about like these roles that our fathers played or that were the traditional role, I find myself like, if the garbages haven't been taken out and it falls on me, I literally will hear myself in my head being like, but that's a man's role. But like, it's not, because like Jason grocery shops sometimes, like it's all so muddled. And I think, what's so important is communication. Like how you were telling Nick you felt alone. It's like letting those things out so that they don't build up, because that's when the blow ups over the dishes happen. And it's not about the dishes. Like that's a moment in time. It's about everything that came before that just festered as resentment. And then I think, for a lot of men in a masculine role, like they are innately fixers. So if we're going to come to them with a problem, they're going to want to fix it. They're going to take it on as their own and they're going to want to fix it. And so as women, sometimes we want a solution and sometimes we just want to vent. And I've had to be real clear in my conversation with Jason, like, this is a solution-based problem, or this is like, I just need to get this off my chest. Like there is so much here. Don't take this on. That has nothing to do with you. I need to vent. And it like almost helps create that barrier for him to not take it on, to know he's just there to listen. I like word vomit. And then I'm like, whoop, I feel better.
Done and done.
Kind of like we do with each other on Voxer. Like,
that's right.
Need to put this here.
Yeah, I think you made a really important point, because if we look at just from a hormonal and behavioral endocrinology perspective, their hormone is testosterone. And that's a very doing hormone. It has to fix, it has to do, it has to be in like momentum and action. And they also have to feel like they've brought things to completion. So this is information we can even take to our young men too, of like our young boys, of like, okay, if the hormone is testosterone, especially as they're developing, how can I help him feel accomplished? So their first instinct is going to be to solve the problem, because they also work from here's point A, here's point B, here's the problem, here's the solution, let's just get there. Whereas us women have like point A, point A1, A2, A3, A4. We have all these different pathways that we go down. So I think releasing that expectation that they are going to know how to respond is so important, so that we can communicate that I don't need a fix it kind of moment right now. I just need you to sit and listen. And if that's not something that can happen in that capacity or in that relationship, that's where our girlfriends come in. That's where our sisters come in, so that we can do that with them and then go to our partners with like, here was the problem. Now, can you help me with the solution?
Yeah.
So I think it's those nuances that if we really learn those about each other, it can be so supportive in a relationship, and knowing that we have this monthly cycle that we move through. So there's a bit more space and time as we move through each phase, whereas they have a 24-hour cycle. So you could probably talk to Jason in the morning about one thing and he'll have one response. You talk to them a few hours later, it might be a completely different response because of that 24-hour cycle and that fluctuation in their hormones throughout the day. So I think there's so many things that will play a role in that communication, from even our physical health, like toxicities, hormones in our environment, cultural, societal expectation. All of that will influence their ability to be here for us and be present.
Makes so much sense. Yeah, let's pivot now. I love this conversation around our men, and I'm so thankful that, men are starting to be open to having these conversations about their feelings and their hormones. And again, it's a tricky world for them to navigate. So I'm glad to have this conversation with you. And now let's pivot into our guys, into our little guys. I was I was surprised at the ages that I started to see hormonal shifts in our boys. It was a lot younger than I thought it would be. And I didn't even fully realize what was happening until I zoomed out. And I think for us, a lot of us moms, it could be very easy to not understand it. And so, what I want to do in this next piece is help create an understanding of what's going on from a hormonal standpoint. I love having conversations with you about, other cultures and tribal communities and how these things are navigated, because I think we can bring some of that into this world.
Mm-hmm.
And then how we can, create an awareness of ourselves and our emotions so that we're supporting our children the best that we can without making it about us, without taking
Mm-hmm.
their normal phases personally,
Mm-hmm.
as they're going through some of these changes. So let's start with like, when do these hormonal shifts start to begin for our boys?
I mean, it can start as young as 3 when they get their first
Oh, wow.
surge of testosterone, and then it kind of goes through these like waves as their like DHEA is coming out around age 5, and it's really around 7 where we start to see some real change, and that change might even look like, wow, he's kind of irritable all of a sudden,
Hmm.
or he's taking things a little bit more personally, or he's wanting a little bit of space away from me.
Hmm.
And all of those things can be really triggering for a mom because we have this expectation also of our children to be a certain way. And when they're constantly changing, we're having to constantly pivot. And that in itself, one brings about an emotion of grief because we're having to let go of that baby or those other years that we've had with them. And then also it brings about frustration because sometimes we don't know how to navigate their emotions because we feel them too. And I
Yeah.
think we've talked about this study before where they tagged the chromosomes in infants and post birth. Well, they tagged the tissues, mostly the Y, to see if there was any tissues left behind in the mothers after birth, and they saw that the tissues that were left behind, they would morph into a mom's like lungs, into her heart,
Mm.
basically become a part of you. So when our children are going through these phases and stages with their hormones and their emotions, it can be so hard to discern like what is my feeling and what is theirs, and then we get caught up in it.
Yeah.
We can get caught up in that emotion. So this morning I was feeling myself getting frustrated that my oldest rolled his ankle. And then I had to pause. I'm like, am I feeling frustrated or am I feeling bad for him? I'm like, oh, I think I'm just feeling his feelings around not being able to play soccer, not being able to do the fun thing. I mean, it's the end of the school year. This is where they
Right.
get to do all the fun stuff. And so I'm feeling his disappointment. And
Mhm.
so I think being able to discern between what is my emotion, what is theirs, and how can I just be there, not to fix it again, right? Because
Yeah.
even us women today, I feel like we also step into that masculine role of wanting to fix everything for them, wanting
Yeah.
to control their environment. And I love what you say is connection over control. So how do we come back into that space of connection for them, hold that space so that they can feel angry, they can feel upset, they can feel disappointed, and know that that's all part of their growth. So,
Mhm.
one conversation I have with both of my boys is about their brains and how their frontal lobe isn't fully developed until they're like 25. So,
Mhm.
that anger that they feel, especially when because sometimes they don't even know why they're feeling it. I
Right.
know there were many times my boys are like, I don't even know why I'm angry.
Yes. Same. Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So then I think just validating that, you know what, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's very confusing growing up. Your hormones are changing, your brain is growing. Like there's so much happening from like the environment, from everything. So it's okay to feel what you're feeling.
Yeah, I agree. I think naming it for them has been really key. There was a time when one of ours said exactly the same thing. I'm so angry and I can't even figure out why.
Hmm.
And so just helping to name him and name it and help him understand it wasn't necessarily him. It's like something going on within his body and that comes and goes and passes and then it's normal. And
Hmm.
that it can be seen as almost exciting because it means he's turning into a man. And, I explained your dad has these same things. It's testosterone and it's fluctuating, and that's what's going to make the hair under your arm, like
Yeah.
explaining it. And he was kind of
Yeah.
giggly and it was a little bit awkward, but like, I think that's important so that they understand what's happening.
Yeah. Normalizing the conversation.
Yeah. And then I've even caught myself in our school, they do a lot of like conscious parenting, which I love. And it's just made me so much more aware of giving them permission to sit with their feelings, which means I have to give myself permission to sit with mine. And like in these moments where my kids have struggles and challenges and are maybe sad, mad, hurt, angry, I caught myself distracting them. So like I would be
Mm-hmm.
silly. I would try to make them laugh. I would like do anything to make them not feel that because it made me sad, right? Like I was feeling
Mm-hmm.
their sadness as an empath. And I thought that would be such a hard switch to navigate, but it's so funny. Like I don't watch the show a lot, but I had seen on an episode, I think it was like Parenthood or whatever that funny show is with like the blended families. And this woman's teenage son was really upset and he was sitting on his bed and you could tell she like didn't know what to do with it. And she said out loud, she's like, I don't even know how to help you. And I'm just going to sit here and be sad with you. Like knowing that we don't have to fix it, but just to provide the space for them to feel what they're feeling. And I think too, I'm very cautious on my podcast. Like I never want to hurt my parents because I think that they did such an incredible job. And like you said, we're just doing different. But the more I'm doing this, I recognize that like I didn't feel safe feeling my feelings in my home. Like if I wasn't happy, then it was like it just didn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it's so important to create the space. I'll tell my kids often, like, you can be mad, you can be sad, I will sit with you through it all. Like, however you want to show up, I love you and support you, and I'm here for you. Like, we don't have to do anything to make it go away. We can feel through it together. And I think that's so key, especially for our boys with all their navigating.
Yeah, and they're so tuned in to our emotions and our facial expressions. My youngest can tell within a second if there's even like a moment of disappointment in my
Mhm.
facial expression or anything. It could be something so simple. So yesterday he didn't eat his lunch. And I thought I made this like beautiful lunch for him. He's gonna eat it. He's my foodie. Like if he could have gourmet meals all day, every day, because he's like, it's not warm when I eat it. And so you just got to give me things that, you know, basic things. So anyways, and then he starts apologizing. And I was like, I don't need you to apologize. You don't have to be sorry for your preference. But what I would like is communication from you because you didn't tell me you weren't going to eat that while I was making it.
Mm.
So I think just giving them permission to be who they are, which is probably one of the hardest jobs as a parent. And I think our parents didn't know how to do that because that wasn't modeled for them.
Right.
And what an opportunity for us to be able to shift that because it was the same in my household. And another layer in my household being a young Indian woman, being a girl itself just felt like a burden in an Indian family. So you don't speak, you don't laugh, you don't cry, you
Wow.
don't really express who you are in any sort of way. So I've had to do a lot of work on unraveling that and also forgiveness around the fact that that is a cultural, societal thing that's been passed down for so many generations. But I get to heal that now for myself so that I can heal that for my kids. So one thing that I've had to really work on in my languaging, because I do a lot of women empowerment work. I do a lot of work now, even with a tea company. We're supporting a clinic in India and it's all around young girls. And I talk about a lot of that because I want my kids to be aware that there is a difference in certain cultures around privilege of being a male versus female.
Mm-hmm.
And what I had to catch myself, and Nick made me aware of this, is we don't want to shame them for being who they are, for
Mm-hmm.
being male, for being men, for this. We don't want to shame them. And I think what's happened since the feminist movement, unintentionally, because the movement was there to really bring up our rights, is that part of that, what ended up happening is a lot of young men started to feel shame
Mm-hmm.
about who they are. And so I'm having to be so careful about the words I choose and how I choose to speak about this. An example I'll give you, one of my friends was saying that someone she knows was complaining that a man opened a door for her while she had groceries in her hands. Like she was quite upset. Like, did he think that I couldn't open it? Why would he think that I need him to open it for me? Like really, really triggered by it. And I think this idea of independence and wanting to do everything on our own has put confusion into their minds. And so I think for the young men that we're raising, it's like, how do we navigate those conversations around like, women empowerment, and at the same time not doing it in a way where we're shaming who they are as an individual.
Yeah. I mean, the whole topic of like toxic masculinity,
Yeah.
it's so crazy to me. Like you go back to, I want to pick your brain on this, like tribal communities. And because this is how we're genetically designed, right? Like our world has changed, but our DNA and our genes haven't.
Yeah.
And so there's a drive and a purpose in men and in women that's very ancestral. And
Hmm.
we're trying to like create a world where that's different. And it's very confusing.
Hmm.
And so, for our boys, I'm curious if we went back to like tribal community living, like what would their role look like and what kinds of rituals are adopted for children around like the age 10 to 14, say when they're navigating these shifts in hormones?
Yeah, so I'll just kind of speak to like my parents' time in India and even my grandparents. If I look at to see how they lived within the village, and we come from the northwestern part of Punjab, so that's all farming. So it was very clear what the roles were in that village. Like the men would get up in the morning, go farm, while the women would, grind the lentils, make the curd, make the ghee, like do all these things, but they're doing them together as a community.
Hmm.
And because that community has been taken away, I think the rituals and the togetherness and all of that allows a young man to recognize that he is held by many and that there are many in his life that play this role of parenting for him in different ways has been taken away because we don't live together in that village format anymore. And culturally, I think what we don't do for men is that initiation. So when they're turning 13, I know, in some cultures they have a walkabout where the young men will go out with the older men in the community, their father, their uncles, and everyone, and go out into the wilderness. And they're talking about what it means to be a man and sharing stories. And maybe, I don't know what they're doing exactly. Maybe they're hunting. I don't back then,
Hmm.
but they're having this opportunity to recognize their strength, recognizing that masculine polarity within them. And I think we don't have that in especially our North American culture where we have that initiation. I think certain cultures do. You can correct me on this with the bar mitzvah. Like, I don't know the significance of, I think it's when they turn 13 that there's a gathering for young kids. And so my husband and I have talked, and we are wanting to do something like that when our oldest turns 13. And of course, for our youngest too, when turns 13, is he will take him out and
Hmm.
gather some of our, like my brother and my brother-in-law and other people in his life that can be a role model for him as he's growing up. And then when he comes back from that, I want to create a community of women that receive him. So then he can step into his softness at the same time to show him that we all have these masculine and feminine polarities and that it's okay to really honor both of those and not feel shamed for either one.
So beautiful, so important. And I love that we're taking from this kind of like how people can recreate this in their lives for their
Hmm.
children. Yeah, I do know of some ceremonies that have been created religiously, and I'm I'm not a religious person, and so even though just this is just me, like I
Hmm.
can see the place for a coming of age or stepping into your place in the religion. I think from what I know, these are not the same as, like a walkabout, or
Hmm.
they've become more like a party and, just like a lot of things.
Mm.
Like it's just gotten sadly watered down over time. I'm sure
Yeah.
initially it was like a very effective ritual and ceremony. But I've even got friends, you can take what you just explained and people can do that in so many different ways that work for them. We
Hmm.
have a friend that when each one of their kids hit 13, their children get to pick a trip. And of course, it's like within their budget. So, okay, maybe it's camping and you get to pick where we go. But they do this, coming of age experience together that's a celebration of like, you are now coming into this community with us adults, and this is
Yeah.
exciting. And there's things that are changing in you. And that's all part of this transformation. And I think that's such an incredible celebration and bonding experience with our kids.
Yeah. I also think it's an initiation for the parents to pivot because up until that point, we've been really parenting in a very different way. And
Hmm.
now what we're doing is we're telling them that, we're kind of side by side now. And so I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to still guide you. I'm still here to provide this safe place for you to do life, but I'm not going to take your hand and move you into a path, but instead I'm going to just open the doors or just sit here while you open your own doors and move into that. And that can be really scary for a parent too, to have to pivot into a different way of connecting with our kids.
Definitely. And I know we're going to talk about, again, supporting them in like the chemical changes with supplements, which I think is really
Yeah.
important in today's world. But before that, just going back to what you just touched on, these changes that they're experiencing and how we have to navigate them as well. And there can be these pieces of grief. There is this natural, like, I don't love this word, but like a separation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like, especially in opposite sex. So, like, my
Mm-hmm.
oldest son has gotten to a place where, and he's my cuddle bug, like, he won't hug me and snuggle with me as much. And I think that's a very natural distancing and separation. And then also, of course, just wanting to spend more time alone in his room. And I'm curious, again, from like a cultural, tribal standpoint, what does this mean? And for those of you who haven't had these kind of conversations before, it's really cool to go back to our roots, because there's certain things that you can look to as like, why are toddlers picky eaters? And it's ingrained in us for survival. So toddlers are thankfully picky eaters, because if they had navigated away from the tribe and they perhaps tasted some berries that were poisonous, like that could be detrimental to continuing our species. So a lot of these things, I just think it's really neat when you can understand like the deeper meaning in our species as to why this happens. It helps create a better understanding.
I always wonder about that because, so just to give some context, we were in Mexico just a little while ago, and we usually stay in places where we're not just in resorts, but we're really kind of in the culture. So the kids get to see how other cultures live. And my oldest made this observation. He's like, I've noticed everywhere we go, but not like in the US or in Canada, that the kids are very involved in the parents' life. So I'm like, yeah, let's talk about that a little bit. And he's like, I just noticed that they're at their shops, that they're just doing stuff with their parents all day, and we see them because my kids go to bed at a certain time, but we're up a little bit later. He's like, the kids are up a little bit later having meals. He's like, it's very different.
Mm-hmm.
And then what I said was, in many cultures, there's a belief that the children come into the world, into the parents' lives, and they're coming into this village or this culture, and they're learning the way of the culture. Whereas I feel in North America, what we've done, and I keep saying North America, I'm sure it's happening in many other places too, but this is just my experience of it. We tailor everything to them.
Yeah.
So their schedules, their picky eating, their this, you know what I mean? So we tailor everything to them, that we forget that it's actually our job to like bring them into our space, into our life. And so I think I'm getting off of the question that you initially asked me.
No, I think that's really important, because we tend to lose ourselves in their schedules, and it's, it creates a lot of the feelings of like why we're burnt out and fried, and then they're not getting that communal feeling. So like our afternoons are spent at sports and all those things.
Yeah. I remember what you were saying, just like the normalcy of like just understanding what they're feeling is normal when they're trying to separate.
Yeah.
And so what I see it as, so for example, again, my only example of that would be my parents and the way they lived in their village. When I go to their homes, there's 2 rooms, right? So everybody lived in this like common space. And there wasn't this thing about you get your own room, you get your own room, you get your own room. Not to say that privacy isn't important, but I think before this time, we were brought up in a very different way, in a very communal way. And so when these transitions were happening, we were noticing it in other people. We were seeing others go through it before us. If I don't have an older sibling, I saw an older cousin, or I saw somebody else moving through this before me. So it's familiar already. And so I think when there's that unit, and for example, in our culture, if we were still living in India, my dad and his brothers, they'd all be living in the same house, and all of us kids would be in the same house too, all of us cousins. So when that was happening, it's like you constantly have people around you that you're growing up with and learning from.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, these changes don't feel so big, but they feel normal.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of the missing link in our isolated lives that we have here because we're so independent and isolated and not really leaning into that way of living. And
Mm-hmm.
not that we need to change the way we're living. This is just a reality of our generation and where we are. But I think just having that understanding of like, there is going to come a time where there is this separation, but how can I still support that and give him permission to be there, but also remind him that he has so much to lean on
Mm.
and give him that container of safety, but then give him space to play.
Yeah.
So I think there's such a balance that I feel a lot of this like wanting to be alone and isolated. I think that's come from our culture here, or like our modern day culture, because I think
Mm-hmm.
innately what we'd want is to be
It's
in
connection.
community and connection.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I never thought about it that way. And what I've done, my older one he really loves alone time, as do I. Like he needs that
Mm-hmm.
kind of space to clear his head. But so I provide that for him. And then I go lay up on his bed with him. And I make it very clear, not by my words, but just by my actions. Like, I'm not looking for anything. I'm just laying here next to you while you're doing your thing. And I'm so happy
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not going anywhere. And I don't have my phone because I'm not bored of you. Like, just be who you are. I'm right here with you. And I think, especially for guys, like their stuff tends to come out at night. And so, as much as he's kind of carved out alone space, like he still wants me there at night to tuck him in and to lay with him. And there's so much that comes from that space. So even if that's like our biggest ritual that we do together right now, that's so important to me because he needs it, he needs it
Yeah.
and he expresses that he needs it. So
Yeah.
thank you. Yeah, so much to think about there.
Yeah. There was an article written by a psychologist several years ago, and she was talking about these preteen, teen years and, how we see that they're isolating themselves and maybe even pushing us away and maybe even making decisions that we don't agree with. But really, at the end of the day, the article was from a teen perspective.
Mm,
And what was said was, I may do all these things. I may even tell you I hate you. I may even reject you in all these ways. But what I really need is a safe place to land.
mm,
And I will always need you, even if my words and my actions in that moment aren't displaying that. So I think that's such a beautiful thing that you're doing of just being there, because that's all they need to feel is
yeah.
that, again, that container of safety so that they can play out all of the emotions and the changes and the transformations that they're going through and the confusion that they're experiencing too.
And how would you, I think the biggest thing for us as mamas to be able to do in that moment is again to take our stuff out of it. So some of these moments can be very soft and beautiful, right? They can be very vulnerable and show that they need us. And some of these moments can be like testosterone filled, anger driven, push away where I find myself having to like take a minute and center myself. And I would love to hear if you have suggestions for people, because I got a few questions when I said I was interviewing someone about this. Like, how do you check your own stuff so that you can be
Mm-hmm.
there supportive
Mm-hmm.
without getting upset or triggered or taking
Yeah.
it on as like you did something wrong?
Yeah. Well, first of all, giving ourselves permission not to be perfect. I'm raising two boys, and then there's Nick in the house too. So the feminine energy is not balanced in my house whatsoever. So there are quite a few moments where I don't get it right. But what I do is in the pause, I will reflect on what could have been done differently, and I go back and I talk about it. I will say that I got triggered because of my own stuff. This has nothing to do with you. There's no fault of yours whatsoever. But in that moment, I felt rejected, or in that moment, I felt overwhelmed and I didn't know what to do with that. So
Mm-hmm.
I think first giving ourselves permission that it's okay if we don't know how to respond in these moments, because especially with our first going through those stages, it's all so new.
Yeah.
and each child will need something so different from the previous one. So I think giving ourselves permission, and then really it is about constantly checking in with ourselves. So this morning when I was having those feelings, I didn't have to relay those feelings to them because I just checked in. Like, okay, I'm having this like anxiety type feeling. Am I getting irritated that I have things to do today and he's here? Or am I feeling upset for him? Or am I feeling like, oh, there goes the weekend? Like there's all these things that show up when something shifts in the routine. And so I paused and I'm like, well, no, I think I'm just feeling really bad for him. And
Yeah.
that's okay.
Yeah.
And so then I was able to turn around and actually just care for him and tape his ankle and give him the red light, put on the arnica. Like I was able to do those things because I not pushed away. I was able to move through all of
Mhm.
that dialogue that was happening just within myself.
Yeah.
And I think pausing and breathing is probably the best thing, or having a word for ourselves too. Maybe it's like, okay, there's the feelings come up and it has to do with our child, having like a safe word for yourself. It could be just be something like connect. Like, okay, I need to connect. I'm going to go to the bathroom for a second
Yeah.
and I will be back. And then that gives us that space to figure out what's actually happening.
Yeah. That pause, that check-in is so
Yeah.
huge. And I think doing it in the moment for me also has been like a muscle that I've been working, because we can say you can say it on the podcast, we could say it on paper, but like when it's really happening and it's raw and you're triggered, it's so easy to just react, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's working that muscle to take that pause, and everything becomes so clear. And once you can take that pause, it's so easy because, like you said, it's just about noticing, it's about naming it. And then I love the creating word for it, like forgiveness is a good word, or connect, or
Mm-hmm.
breathe, or pause, like take a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also found too, like when I go to pick them up, even if I'm rushing around and I'm going from work and my head's going a million miles an hour, that pause again is really key. Like I want to pause and kind of like clear out any feelings I'm having just by having an awareness of them. Whew, today was heavy. My head's going so fast. I'm going to write stuff down, whatever it is to kind of like move it over a little bit to create the space for them. I don't know if you find like when I pick them up from school, I feel like the saying on Statue of Liberty, like, give me you're hungry, you're tired, you're poor. Like it just
Yeah.
all comes at you. Like
Uh-huh.
one's mad, one's angry, one's
Yep.
fighting. I'm just like, I
Yeah.
have to be in a
One's
place.
asking to go here, or
Oh,
one's,
yeah.
a friend wants to come over. Like
And
there's
it's all
just
your fault.
everything. Yeah. Everything is your fault in that moment, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just gonna say there was this video that I did like I feel like about a year ago, and how what if we approached everything from that childlike perspective of just being in awe, even of ourselves. So even with our thoughts. So when those emotions come up or when the thoughts show up, just, being like, wow, I'm still stuck in that. Like, wow, like that still triggers me. Like, oh my goodness, that feeling of rejection is so real. Like, where else did I feel that? So I think just being in awe of everything can really shift and bring some lightness to it too, because we're so hard on ourselves as mothers.
Yeah.
And we expect perfection from ourselves, especially when we want to do this conscious parenting, and we're going to mess up, and
Yeah.
that's okay.
That's okay. Yeah. And we can role
Yeah.
model for them. Like you said, you go back and you have the conversation again.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
wasn't what I wanted it to be. It gives them permission to do the same.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer is such a
Mm-hmm.
great resource for this stuff, because it helps you kind of like step out of yourself and be the observer.
Yeah.
So it's like, wow, all these feelings are going on. And for me, it helps me like not get so heavy in the feeling, but the noticing and not
Mm-hmm.
judging, and then being able to move through it, like you said. I want to touch on their hormones. I never knew the male hormone cycle was 24 hours. Let's talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then what can we do to help support their fluctuating hormones from a food perspective, like what's great, what's not so great, supplement perspective, because I think that's just like a really easy way that we can help them navigate the changes.
For sure. So looking at it, the idea of the 24-hour cycle. So maybe let's look at the developing into puberty, and recognizing that there are so many things in our environment that will influence how they step into that part of their life. And so DHEA, as we know, is the precursor to testosterone, and testosterone can go into estrogen, even in young men. So the things that will influence DHEA, the primary thing would be stress. And we often, think about young girls and emotions and things like that because they're just more easily expressed through them. But even our little guys, when we look at the statistics around like ADHD, anxiety, all of this, it's starting younger and younger. The diagnoses are, and the anxiety also is starting younger and younger. So we're seeing that like a lot of the young boys are also having these like emotional challenges. And so if we can understand hormonally things are changing for them, what's going to influence one, the hormones, and then are the hormones influencing their responses to the different stressors that they're going through. So, in general, I would say this might be taking it off topic a little bit. The school system isn't really built for their development. So we kind of put everybody in one little box of like everyone needs to develop the same way. And so at home, if we can start to support them and help them understand how their cycle works and how much play they need during the day and that they just need to really be in their body, that can be so important for their relationship with themselves and even their friends and even with us. So looking at their environment, like, are they stressed out? Like, I think kids today are feeling more pressure at a very young age, even starting at like kindergarten.
Yeah.
So just checking in with them, like, how are you doing? And looking at their regulation, like, how are they able to regulate their nervous system? Like, how can I help him regulate, whether it's through just teaching him the pause or teaching him a word or teaching him to be able to move his body, maybe if he's having a lot of feelings in that moment, because that is going to fuel how much of that DHEA rises, because as cortisol goes up, which is our stress hormone, DHEA goes down. So then really teaching his adrenals and his nervous system to reset after he's had a stressful moment. And this is where sports and like these things can be so beautiful for them, because they have then an outlet to really navigate those adrenals. So there's that piece. And then looking at the testosterone and estrogen piece, our environment is full of estrogen. So the plastics, the foods, the pesticides, really looking at our children's environment, like, are they taking in these exogenous estrogens, which will then inhibit the growth, their testosterone? What does their daily habits look like in regards to sugar when they wake up in the morning? What are we feeding them for breakfast? Is it a healthy fat and protein? I mean, this is something I'm still working on, even though with all my knowledge, but they got stuck in that this is what breakfast looks like. But we're shifting that slowly and helping them understand, hey, you want to perform in soccer, let's shift your breakfast so that you have more fuel. Mm-hmm. So the lifestyle things around what are they eating? Are they eating organic? How are they in their nervous system will then help support the rise in their testosterone. And from a supplement perspective at that age, I sometimes give my oldest some saffron, which can really be supportive for one, his adrenals and his testosterone. I detox my kids, as I know you do too, making sure we're detoxifying those estrogens. I'm checking in with their gut health to make sure that those excess estrogens are moving out of their body and not getting stuck. So there's a few different layers to it, but I would say the simplest thing would be to just work on their food, what they're having every day, how they're moving, how much they're moving, and then bringing that nervous system back into check.
Love all that. That's so helpful. And I know the other day we were talking about how, whereas women, we need quiet space often to ground and navigate and figure out, challenges and solutions. Boys need movement and play.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's so great. If the school is designed as a traditional public school, which many are, and many of our kids attend them, it's like we can get them outside and moving and playing and get that proprioceptive input that helps ground them and get them in their bodies. And then, when we talk about like the importance of fat and protein for breakfast, this is one that I think is so important to drive home the why, because when parents understand the why, I think it becomes easier to get them off these sugary cereals in the morning. So why is fat and protein important? And then why is choosing organic important? And what are the most important things for our boys to have organic if we can't do them all?
Yeah. So in the morning, our growth hormone and our testosterone is rising. This is for both men and for women. So growth hormone, our boys need for their growth, for their brain, for all of that, for healing. Testosterone, again, we need for the reproductive system and for their moods and also for muscle mass, all of those things. So when we start to talk to our boys about that, like, hey, these two things are really going to help you. and support you in all the things that they love to do. So when we eat a sugary cereal or pancakes with lots of syrup on them, all these things will increase our insulin and our glucose. And so when insulin and glucose rise, it basically tells that other system to shut down. It shuts down the growth hormone, it shuts down the testosterone. So if we're doing that every single day, we're working against their innate intelligence. We're working against what their body's actually wanting and needing them to do. We're working against their growth. We're working against their nervous system. So by fueling them with sugar in the morning, not only are we going against what their body is needing, we're definitely going to have a crash in the next few hours because that glucose will rise and then it will fall, it will come down. So there's no stability in their mood. So now we have these young kids getting labeled in their classrooms that they don't have any attention, that they can't stay in their seats. It's because we're not fueling them in the morning with what their brain actually needs to last those so many hours in that classroom.
Yeah, girls too. I mean, the same thing
Yeah.
would happen with that
Mhm.
breakfast.
With the organic food, I would say the meats for sure, because we know that they're pumped with hormones, they're pumped with antibiotics, and we know how detrimental that can be if it does nothing shows up now, but also for their future as they're developing. And for fruits and vegetables, if you just look at the dirty dozen, if you can't do all of it, because that will give you an indication of like what fruits, for example, strawberries really soak those pesticides in. And so when we can look at the dirty dozen, we can then make choices that are a little bit different.
Excellent. So helpful. And then one of the final questions on chemical stuff, because I know we got to wrap soon. I am so concerned with the sports drinks that I am seeing marketed towards, especially these young
Yes.
boys. The new one,
Mhm.
Prime, that's out. It's like, I don't know if parents aren't reading the nutritional labels, or maybe there's like a lack of understanding of how detrimental these fake sugars, the caffeine can be. Can you touch on that at all and how you feel about it?
Yeah. So there was a case with Prime, and I still have to look into this. It was a TikTok that I saw, so I don't know what the validity is there, but like a young male really got sick after having Prime and maybe even had a heart condition after it. So the caffeine, as we know as adults, we know what too much caffeine can do. It creates anxiety.
Yeah.
It has a toll on the adrenal glands. So again, if we're creating that amount of stress and adrenaline in their body, we are shutting down their testosterone. We are shutting down their growth hormone. We are shutting down these hormones that their bodies need to feel steady and to feel safe, even in their bodies.
Mhm.
And when we're giving them even like color, for example, like red number 40, yellow number 6 and 7. And the fact that boys are diagnosed with ADHD more than girls are, I know there's many different layers to it, but then if we're giving them these drinks that have these colors, we are creating havoc in their brains. We are creating this chemical toxicity in their brains. So they can't focus. It's going to shift their memory. It's going to shift their moods. And it's very detrimental for their overall health. And when we look at just natural flavors, we don't know where these natural flavors are coming from. And so it's so important. I know the basis of a lot of these drinks is like we got to fuel the electrolytes, but there's so many other ways you can do that. You can even do that simply with coconut water, organic coconut water. You will refuel their electrolytes. A little bit of sea salt in their water will refuel their electrolytes. There's safer drinks and powders that you can get to put in their water to give them that same feeling. And so what we've done in our house, we read labels all the time with our kids. So after my youngest soccer practice, there have been drinks coming like Gatorade. Prime hasn't shown up yet, but I've seen other kids drinking it, juice boxes, things like that. And he doesn't even go close to it because he already knows.
He knows. Yeah.
I mean, hopefully that stays. Maybe one day he's going to go and try it, but he knows that the labels need to be read.
Yeah, these conversations are so important because when you understand
Yeah.
the why, it's so much easier. I'll link below some of the electrolytes like we use in our home. I
Yeah.
think it's important to have that swap out because kids, they want to have what other kids are having. But
Yeah.
yeah, the marketing around it being the electrolytes, like just read the back of Gatorade. It's toxic
Yeah.
soup.
Yes.
It's like high
Yes, that's
fructose
all it
corn
is.
syrup and food coloring. There's
Yeah.
nothing in
Well,
there that you need.
Yeah. The sad thing is, I mean, luckily we don't have commercials, but I remember growing up and seeing people that I looked up to drinking these drinks and then not questioning
Yeah.
what's in them. So I think the change really has to be from that position too, on like looking at like what are we doing to our kids and how are we influencing them. But when we know, like we have the knowledge now, we can definitely do those swap outs to do better.
Oh,
Yeah.
Sonya, thank you so much for this conversation. Definitely, guys, go
Thank
follow
you.
her channel. Her and Nick's podcast is so great. And actually, you and Nick had done an episode on male hormones that sparked this conversation and me wanting to bring it to my platform. Your teas are incredible. Everything you're doing for women is amazing. I love your book and just love you, love you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Love you so much and love you for doing this and creating so much awareness around these topics.
Thank you, Sonya. I'll see you soon. I hope you walk away from that episode with a better understanding of how to support your growing kids and their changing moods, behaviors, and needs with their hormonal fluctuations. If you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and throw a like under it. As always, I love to hear your comments, so go ahead and put those below. And thank you for passing this episode along to someone else in your life who has children this age who needs this information. Make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future episodes, and I'll see you soon.